In these difficult times where most of the world has been under some kind of lockdown, it is imperative for us to ensure the free flow of knowledge and scientific information. GLF's Brave New World was born out of this intent, and we're delighted to celebrate our 50th session of the season. We would like to thank all our brilliant speakers, including Nobel laureates Abhijit V. Banerjee and Esther Duflo, Orhan Pamuk, two-time Booker Prize winner Margaret Atwood and Peter Carey, Pulitzer Prize winners Anne Applebaum, Benjamin Moser, Jhumpa Lahiri, Siddharth Mukherjee, Stephen Greenblatt, and a slew of amazing writers, Ajit Lalwani, Chitra Banerjee Devakurni, Elizabeth Gilbert, Elif Shafak, Gloria Steinem, Michael Palin, Otto Lengi, Peter Morgan, Peter Frankopan, Rupi Kaur, Ruskin Bond, Shashi Tharoor, Shubha Mudgal, T.M. Krishna, and so many others. You may catch all of these amazing sessions on our Facebook page, GLF Litfest, or on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest GLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM, Bajate Raho. And we would especially like to thank our technical partners, Web Context. Our next session is The Economics of COVID. Zanny Minton Beddoes, Editor-in-Chief of The Economist, speaks to Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, Mihir Sharma, on the current economic scenario and the fast-changing world around us, and how the world must find its feet post-COVID-19. Zanny Minton Beddoes, during her 25 years at the newspaper, she has written special reports on the world economy, Germany, Latin America, American finance, global finance, and Central Asia. Mihir Sharma is Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and head of its Economy and Growth Program. And in 2019, he co-edited What the Economy Needs Now with Abhijit V. Banerjee, Geeta Gopinath, and Raghuram Rajan. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest GLF. And remember, if we drop off, just hang in there. We'll be right back on Facebook. Ladies and gentlemen, the economics of COVID.
Thank you, Sanjoy, and thank you, Zanny, for being here and for speaking to us at what must be a very busy time for you.
Very welcome.
As it is, I'm sure for a lot of people in in our in the sort of the media field, I write a column, and you're never running out of things to say.
That is certainly true. This has been, it's extraordinary actually. I mean, it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for having me. It's been, I mean, for all of us, an absolutely extraordinary time. I mean, we have just put the 10th issue of The Economist out, which we've produced completely remotely. All of our films, all of our podcasts, everything that we do is being done by my colleagues, often in quite interesting conditions, colleagues with young children making podcasts by hiding in their cupboards so that their children don't disturb them. But it has been, I mean, we are very lucky. You know, we can do our jobs remotely, and it has been actually striking how relatively easily we have shifted to being fully remote. We use, I'm sure like you, we use Zoom as we are doing now, we use Slack, we use Google Hangout, we use all manner of technologies. But actually, I've been very struck looking back how the technical side of producing the newspaper has actually shifted relatively easily to being completely remote. And at the same time, we are living through this extraordinary, tragic, but just sort of devastating and almost incomprehensible in its scale pandemic. And so it's the most extraordinary experience of our lifetime. And to be able to be a journalist trying to make sense of this, trying to explain to our readers, trying to help understand not only where things are and what's happening now, but as you say, where things are going, is just sort of an extraordinary responsibility, really, and privilege. So we've all been, my colleagues have been amazing and working unbelievably hard. And I hope, producing some fantastic journalism that has actually helped people really make sense of this.
Well, I think we're going to come back to a lot of the, some of that stuff that you said about the workplace in a bit. But I wanted to sort of start maybe by talking about, over the weekend, we in India were told that essentially outside containment zones, our lockdown is coming to an end. And we're not quite sure what those containment zones are. But in effect, our lockdown, which of course, as you know, has been one of the most stringent in the world, and if not the most stringent in the world, is coming to an end after, it was announced on March 26th. It's been quite a while. But you must have been sort of observing the ways in which different economies are going about the reopening process. And is there some way in which we don't know what the outcome of reopening is? And I don't mean in a public health sense. I mean purely in the sense of we're not going back to normal.
Well, I'm very sure we're not going back to normal anytime soon, and probably not even ever. The status quo post-COVID will not be the same as the status quo before COVID. I think we are moving also in the UK actually to the sort of next phase of lockdown, the very stringent lockdowns that were put in place by governments who really felt no option, because they just felt it was absolutely imperative to get the R, if you will, the rate of transmission under control. But we are seeing the extraordinary impact this has had on economies, and I'm sure we'll talk later about the different capacities in different countries to deal with that. But I think we're now moving perforce into a second stage, and a stage where the hope is to keep the pandemic under control while opening up parts of the economy. And I think that then becomes much more like the way that epidemiologists have classically dealt with outbreaks in the past, which is, as you say, to focus on areas where there is an outbreak, to focus on particularly vulnerable populations, to focus on places that we know and interactions that we know to be particularly vulnerable. So whether it is, butcheries and meatpacking factories, whether it is old people's homes, whether it is areas where people are crammed in close together, these, we are learning around the world, are particularly vulnerable. We know what particularly vulnerable populations are. And I think we're going to move, I hope we're going to move to a much more targeted approach that will enable us to sort of get the economy going again, because we're seeing the extraordinary cost of this. And it's simply not sustainable to lock down, to put the entire economy into a coma as we have done. It may be sustainable for longer in richer countries, but even there it's not sustainable. And there are very, very serious consequences, economic, psychological, on all manner of things. But even as that happens, and heaven forbid, I hope we can carry on without a second wave, as people are talking about. So let's assume we can do that and do it well. I don't think we will go back to anything like the world we had before. And the reason is severalfold. Firstly, that until we have a vaccine widely available and widely administered, the disease is still here and with us, and the risks are still here. And so there will still be the need for some social distancing. So many industries, many activities, many parts of the economy that depend on people being in close proximity to one another will have to either not operate at all, or if they do operate in a very different way. And that is, the hospitality industry, crowded restaurants, crowded bars, outdoor mass entertainment, the tourism industry, a huge global industry, 7% of global exports. But right now, almost every country still has restrictions on travel. So there will be sectors for whom, even with a partial unwinding of the lockdown, we're not going to go back to anything that we had before. And that means that the economy as a whole will need to reconfigure. There will be some sectors, some industries that will do much better. I mean, e-commerce has taken a huge step forward because of the pandemic. And we will need to reallocate resources from sectors that will not return to sectors that are growing. And that reallocation, I think we simply haven't started yet. And that's going to take a fairly long period of time. And we wrote about this a few weeks ago. We put it on our cover and we called it the 90% economy, because it's really an economy where overall things return, but they don't go back to where they were. And some sectors are the 50% economy, some are the 100% economy. But overall, it is an economy that is not what it was. And we can talk about it, but that has very big impacts, I think, for the pace of innovation. It has very big impact in inequality. It has very big impacts for huge trends that have identified our world economy. So the sort of short answer is, you're completely right. The post-COVID economy is not the same as the pre-COVID economy.
I think there are a couple of things there that I want to sort of follow up on. I think the first is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe it's a little intriguing that there are, as you pointed out, some sectors that will not be able to operate the same way that they did earlier, maybe because they are more prone to becoming hotbeds for spreading the virus. But it's interesting, isn't it, that in many cases, I'm not talking about restaurants, maybe restaurants are an exception, but in many of these cases, it's not as if governments everywhere have come out very quickly with a new set of occupational safety regulations. In many cases, it's the companies themselves that are having to try and figure out as they go along. And I think that that's quite intriguing, that it's governments have not been able to respond in terms of regulating industry quite as quickly as perhaps you would have expected.
And you're right. I'm not really surprised by that for two reasons. I think governments are always slower than the private sector. I think the private sector always innovates faster than governments. And secondly, governments have been in crisis management mode. They've been in, how are we going to get the R rate down? How are we going to make sure our health systems are not overwhelmed? They have not been having their usual long-term planning processes. I think we're going to get that, but I think everybody is learning as they go along, because this is, a hitherto unknown disease. And so we don't know, is it, for example, 2 meters that you have to stay apart? Is it 1 meter? Is it 1 arm's length? Do face masks work? Do face masks not work? We're learning, and our knowledge is evolving, and hence what is a safe working practice is changing. And I suspect where we will see interesting differences is between governments that are more risk averse and governments that are less risk averse. And we'll see that, we're seeing it in between individual states too. And actually, for me, I think that we are going to need experimentation, because we're going to, no one really knows. And so we're going to have to learn from, one country's experience over another. But you're right. Yes, governments haven't come up with a kind of regulatory rule, but they will. Don't worry. Governments always have
just in time for the next pandemic 50 years from now, probably. So, but the other point that you did make is that in some sense, the costs of this are enormous, perhaps even incalculable, because there's so much that's not properly priced that we've lost. But, if you could give us a sense of those of us in India in particular, we haven't spent a great deal on our stimulus packages. We haven't, on our relief packages, I should say, because they're not really a stimulus. They're 10% of GDP, according to the Prime Minister, but then that's including monetary stimulus, that's including liquidity measures and so on. In terms of actual spending, they're closer to about 1% of GDP. But this is dwarfed by the kind of money that the UK and the US and Europe, for example, are putting on the table, right?
Absolutely. I mean, massively dwarfed. And one of the striking characteristics of this is the scale of the fiscal and monetary response in broadly the West. So as you say, in the US, in Europe, Japan too, but the US and Europe particularly, the spigots have been really well and truly opened. And I think much more, for example, than they were in 2008, where it took longer in the wake of the global financial crisis than to get what had happened now. And I think one reason is that this was governments which themselves put the economy into a coma, responding with the support that was therefore necessary. So it was a very clear, it was government fiat that locked the economy down, and hence there was and I think correctly, a sense that government had to respond really strongly. However, and it is also true, of course, that the Western economies that issue debt in their own currency, that particularly the US is able to, they are able to do these enormous fiscal stimulus packages and monetary stimulus packages. And we can talk about, the degree to which that can go on, but certainly there is a degree of freedom there that many emerging markets do not have. So this was, if you can do it, use it. In the short term, I think that was absolutely the right response. What is really interesting is what happens now as we get to the stage that you and I have been talking about, of economies coming out of lockdown but needing to be restructured, resources needing to be reallocated. And one of the interesting things that certainly in Europe, many of the schemes have done the furlough schemes, which are schemes where the government pays the wages of workers even if they're not actually working, but they're still attached to their employer, or state aid for specific industries. These are schemes which essentially sort of preserve the economy in aspect. They preserve existing companies, they preserve existing jobs. But to the degree that resources need reallocating, that's actually in the long run not the right thing to do, because people whose jobs are never going to be viable need to, move to a different job, need to retrain, need to kind of, when they go back to work, it'll be something different. And right now, I think we are just on the cusp in Europe of a risk that some of this government support essentially freezes an economy that isn't going to come back. Whereas the US has actually taken a slightly different view. It has thrown resources, thrown fiscal stimulus in the form of a check to all Americans and in the form of very, very generous unemployment insurance. But the people have become unemployed. As you know, the unemployment numbers have shot up in the United States. And they are being paid generously. And actually a striking number of people in the United States now earn more from their unemployment check than they did in the job that they lost. I mean, it's by American standards extraordinarily generous. But they are unemployed and they are going to have to go and find a different job. And so it is a different form of fiscal stimulus. So you're right, the scale is massive in the West, and the scale of monetary support is massive. Essentially, the spigots have been open to support pretty much every form of debt market. Go ahead. You look as though you want to ask me something else.
Yes, but Zanny, the point being that now in politics after this, people are going to say, you opened the spigots, you didn't worry about debt, you didn't worry about deficits, you didn't worry about central bank independence, you didn't worry about all the other nonsense you've been talking about for a decade. Why should we continue to worry about it? And why should we not cut taxes, increase spending, whatever? I mean, what's the...
So this is going to be a really interesting question. How much the sort of philosophical sort of zeitgeist around macro policy shifts. And it was already shifting in much of the West because our inflation was so low, because interest rates are near zero. There was already a view that, big deficits, big debt didn't really matter that much. I mean, the US was running, I think, a 5% of GDP budget deficit before the pandemic. It's going to be 15% of GDP, I think, this year, but 5 before. And the idea that, you had to keep debt below a certain proportion of GDP was already essentially falling out of favor because there was just, the consequence of higher deficits and high debt burdens we were always taught was competition for scarce resources, higher interest rates, and a higher debt servicing burden. But look at the case of the United Kingdom now, which is really striking. In the wake of this enormous fiscal stimulus that Rishi Sunak, the British Chancellor, has announced, the projected interest bill of the British government has actually gone down because the interest rate outlook has fallen so much because the inflation outlook has fallen that notwithstanding all this extra spending, the projected interest bill has gone down. And so I think there is actually the debate is changing because, as Keynes said, if the facts change, I change my opinion. And I think there is some of that going on now. In the short term, I don't think these deficits are a huge risk. But what I think is going to be really interesting is, one, in the medium term, what happens? Because, I'm enough of a kind of believer in traditional macro that I think eventually if you spend like this, you're going to have inflation and pressure on interest rates. It may not happen next year, but at some point you will. And in the West, it's that we live in aging societies. We have huge ongoing structural burdens on budget deficits. And so somehow we have to get back to more prudent fiscal policy. And I think that is going to be a very painful conversation. My suspicion is it's going to lead to higher taxes. I wish it would lead to a reappraisal of what the welfare state should look like in the 21st century. So spending reform, not just tax reform. But I suspect there will be much more talk about tax, and there will be much more talk about progressive taxation, because one of the other trends that we've been seeing is very, very wide income gaps, and talk about taxing the wealthy more. And that's right, and there will be more of that. My hope is that it will be a thoughtful, rational conversation. There's all kinds of taxes you could usefully have, right? Tax inheritance, tax land. Frankly, this is the best time to introduce a carbon tax. we had a whole cover on this 10 days ago. You know, this is the time to do that kind of stuff. Will we have that kind of conversation? I don't know. But the other bit that worries me actually almost more than the whole fiscal conversation is that we have ended up now with these huge bailouts for individual companies, individual industries. You know, that is about as far from, you know, a free market, laissez-faire position as you can get. So Europe, one of whose greatest achievements of the European Union was the creation of the single market. And the single market meant that there were very strict rules on how much state aid governments could give their company. That's all been thrown out of the window. I mean, literally thrown out, not literally thrown out of the window, but metaphorically thrown out of the window. And I think that will really undermine the single market. You know, Germany has given by far the most state aid because it's the biggest, richest economy. It's hard to see how you can have a completely open market if you don't have a level playing field. So I'm very worried about that.
Yes, and it's going to sort of weaken your argument if you're Europe and you're going and sitting down opposite the People's Republic of China and saying, as it happens, you know, you're not a real market economy because your state-owned enterprises are, you know, are given various subsidies. And they're going to turn around and say, well, as it happens, every enterprise in Europe is now a state-owned enterprise. So, you know, what are you going to do about that?
Well, it's not quite yet a state-owned enterprise. It's certainly a state bailed-out enterprise. But yes, well, I take your point. No, you're right. And it is, I don't think, you know, because this has been so much has happened so fast, and everybody has, you know, understandably and rightly been so focused on the here and now of how do we get this pandemic under control. I think we're only just waking up to the enormity of what we've done in terms of, you know, enlarging the size of the state and enlarging the expectations that people will have for what the state can do for them.
Absolutely. But since we sort of got to China in a sort of roundabout manner, let's talk about that, because I think a lot of people are looking around the world right now and saying, well, it appears everybody is reopening. People are trying to work out how to reopen, but the only country that seems to be, as you say, getting at least close to 90% is mainland China. And you know, we can talk about whether that's irritating under the circumstances, but definitely they worked a little, they got at it earlier, and now it appears that they're close to reopening, or they're close to, as you say, 90%. Now, the question that we have here is that, are we talking about a further strengthening of their broad argument that they've been taking to many parts of the emerging world in particular, that in dealing with crises like this, in dealing with, you know, the problems of development, our management of the economy, the way that we control the financial system, is a better way than what you've been taught so far?
Well, that's certainly, or at least a form of that, is clearly what they are trying to do. I mean, there's been an absolute, as you know, sort of huge propaganda effort by the Chinese, both to, you know, deflect attention from the fact that they did cover up the virus at the beginning and, you know, therefore do bear some culpability for this. And secondly, to focus on the great generosity of the Chinese people in helping people around the world. And thirdly, you know, showing off the contrast between, you know, China's handling and, in their view, particularly the United States handling, which is, you know, I think in China's telling would show how, you know, abjectly useless a democracy is. I mean, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but that's sort of what you know, I think there is a sense of national pride and sort of very aggressive nationalism right now in China. But I think if you unpack that, I'm not sure. I think the heavy-handedness of some of that Chinese state-driven approach has actually backfired. I mean, certainly in Africa, there's been some very sort of heavy-handed propaganda, and then the treatment of African nationals within China, you know, really backfired on them. Secondly, I think if that was genuine, and if there was a genuine desire to sort of play a global leadership role, and my goodness, there's a vacuum of global leadership right now. I mean, the United States really has been sort of missing in action in terms of its traditional global leadership role. I don't really see China stepping up to that in any way that, you know, we would recognize as what one would hope for from a sort of responsible global leadership role. I mean, its behavior in what it's doing in Hong Kong in its own backyard, I'm sure we can get onto that. There isn't a sense in which China is stepping up either, frankly, in the handling of the pandemic broadly, but also in, you know, longer term themes, whether it's climate change and so forth, although there is a huge option now. So I'm not as sure as I think at least the premise of your question suggests, that China's approach holds as much appeal as they would like it to. I don't think it's playing as much of a kind of responsible leadership role. That said, it's clearly showing up the weaknesses that are there from the vacuum of the US. And I think there's also a sense of China's growing clout. It matters. And so, as a customer of China, as an economy, as any economy that deals with China, it is there. It is increasingly aggressive in the way it behaves, and it's an important calculus for everybody to work out how they deal with China.
But I mean, isn't part of what people are thinking about now that they have to deal with this newly aggressive and nationalistic China, that maybe it's been revealed, particularly in January and February, the degree to which we were all dependent upon production there. And in some sense, this is a universal signal that everyone's picked up on. Companies, governments in the West, governments here in the emerging world, that, okay, this is a problem that at some point we will have to deal with, and now we're all aware of it. Maybe we can deal with it together.
I think there's some of that. I think there's also a growing sense, or at least the sort of initial sense was, how can we possibly rely on one purveyor of protective equipment, and that being China? And there's a kind of global scramble for health equipment. And that has precipitated a broader concern about the way we've built global supply chains to be so dependent on production in China. And I think there are sort of two consequences from that. One is the very sensible, and I think it's happening, consequence that resilience requires diversification in supply chains. And I think we're seeing some of that. We're seeing a regionalization of supply chains. What worries me is if resilience is taken to mean autarkic national production. And I think there's a bit of a risk of that now. There's a risk that countries equate being resilient with producing everything at home, with strategic, autonomy that is sort of based at home. And that would not only really radically undermine globalization, which I think has been of huge benefit, particularly to large numbers of people in the emerging world, but has more broadly. It would drive a coach and horses through that. It also, I don't think, leaves individual countries actually better off. I mean, I think the basic reasons for trade and the basis of comparative advantage is that you gain more from trading, not from a kind of autarkic system where you try and produce everything yourself. So I worry about the consequences of sort of what essentially has been a trifecta of shocks for globalization. We had the financial crisis in 2008, which made us all realize fragilities in the financial system. Then the US-China trade war, where the two biggest behemoths of global trade, particularly the US, behaves in this very unilateral and destabilizing way. And now the pandemic. And I think if you add those three together, globalization as we knew it is in a very, very shaky spot right now.
It's interesting that you point out that some countries might take the wrong lesson from this, because the fact is that you never know what it is that will turn out to be of strategic importance to you. 6 months from now, if you would come to me and said, if you don't have PPE, the entire PPE supply chain in your own country, it's going to be a disaster. As a policymaker anywhere in the world, I'd chuck you out of the room because you don't know exactly.
But I don't think you do need it in your own country. That's the point. I think
exactly.
It was imprudent to rely on one supply chain largely with China and China alone. I think resilience comes from diversification. So ensure that you have diverse sources, not from autarkic producing everything at home.
I think the issue was that we discovered in January and February in particular, and it's beyond PPEs, when everyone began to worry that Chinese factories would not reopen in time, that pretty much every supply chain actually was dependent on China. And I think that is, in many ways, the crucial lesson that people took away from that feeling of, oh my God, my inventories are getting shorter and shorter, when will they reopen? And was that, okay, this particular geography definitely has more of a hold on our supply chains, which we thought were very diffuse. than were earlier. We have to go to questions fairly soon, but I want to sort of talk about two last things before I get to them. The first, very quickly, you mentioned Hong Kong. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about it. What does this mean? Does this mean that Hong Kong is over as a financial center? You know, it used to be New York, London, Hong Kong, the three places that you would have to sort of pass through if you were in the business. What happens now?
I think it's a really important question. I think we haven't, I don't know is the answer. It depends on how China behaves. What has become very clear is that China is determined to exert full control there. It was in 1997 when the handover took place. Geoffrey Howe, who was then the foreign secretary, referred to Hong Kong as a precious Ming vase, a Ming vase that had to be handed from the British to the Chinese without being broken. And by that, it was really a metaphor for the specifics of Hong Kong, its rule of law, its free speech, all the things that make Hong Kong unique. I think that what we've learned in the last 10 days is that China is perfectly prepared to break that Ming vase if it needs to. It is determined to exert control. I suspect what they will try to do is to clamp down, but do so in a way that retains Hong Kong's ability to be a financial center, but increasingly to be a mainland Chinese dominated one. And there was someone told me just today, actually, a wonderful metaphor, which is that Hong Kong is an adapter. Like an electric adapter that essentially transforms between two different voltages and two different systems. And if you overload an adapter, then it blows up. And so that I think there's a question.
Is that in a magazine somewhere, or can I steal it?
I heard it from my correspondent, who I think heard it from someone else. So we'll have to find out. But it's a very good line. It's an extremely good metaphor. What it means, I think, is that if China goes too far, then, and the US, which has, the US has one very, very powerful nuclear weapon, which is no longer recognizing Hong Kong as a separate entity, and thereby imposing sanctions and all manner of tariffs and so forth, from which the biggest victims would be Hong Kongers themselves and Hong Kong. But I think there is a path that China will try to tread, which increasingly will mean that it is the conduit to the global capital markets for mainland Chinese, the way in which the sort of signification or the growth of the Chinese area of global finance advances. So it will become ever less like the Hong Kong that we knew, more Chinese. But if they go too fast and there is a slapping down of sanctions and the place blows up, then everybody loses. So I think we will see it, is it finished or not? I think the Hong Kong that we thought we knew, of complete freedom of speech, of essentially a Western enclave, I think that Hong Kong is increasingly finished.
Right, and the last question before I go to the Q&A, talk to me about the media. I mean, how is, in India, we've gone through a large, a number of layoffs, very sort of public, widely discussed layoffs in large newspapers. Is this one of those businesses that is not going to be the same going forward?
I think it is going to not be the same. I think it depends a little bit on what form of media and what its business model is. So clearly advertising has been hit extremely hard. So any newspaper or media organization that depends wholly or overwhelmingly on our advertising has
most
really
of our
seen
newspapers here.
Which that's been a real, that's why they've been really badly hit. The other is an area that many media companies, including The Economist, have moved into, which is the events business, live events. That's also been hit enormously hard. Now, that may come back in some form, but for the moment, I think it's very clear people are not going to be able to go to or want to go to live events. And so you can really see that those media organizations that are advertising funded hit extraordinarily hard. And then the third one, I guess, is daily print. If you are producing a daily print product, simply the distribution of a daily print product is extremely difficult. And so I think this will accelerate the move to digital across all media organizations, but particularly daily ones. And unfortunately for many and luckily for us, those that were already, essentially subscription dominated, and The Economist had moved towards a model of subscriptions that are overwhelmingly important for us. Thank goodness, we've seen circulation grow. We've had, there's been a huge demand for our journalism. And since we were already expecting people to pay for it, that's, that those are the areas that are doing, relatively well. But I think overall it will accelerate what had been already a fairly dramatic shift for many media companies, and those particularly local papers that rely on advertising. This for many is going to be very hard to see how they survive.
Right, so let's move to some of the questions we've been sent in. Rachita has asked us, saying that why, a lot of people are saying that a basic minimum income is something of a necessity, and particularly in the context of the pandemic. But there is a school of thought that believes that it will lead to, it leads to, where she said a complacency, but I think that maybe that's a little harsh. But in essence, that there is something very specific about working for a living, and something around the notion of having a career, a vocation, and so on and so forth, which having a guaranteed basic minimum income wouldn't provide. And just to sort of follow on that, I've noticed that this is a concept that both people on the right and people on the left agree on, that maybe there's something special about work, but basic minimum income is also something that many people on the right and many people on the left, there's no clear sort of political division about it. It seems to...
You're absolutely right. Both UBI, as it's called, Universal Basic Income, has adherents on the left and the right. And it's an idea that was, in many quarters gaining momentum before the pandemic. And it was one that I think this debate will certainly be sharpened, because in effect, the US gave, a check of whatever it was, $1,000 or something to pretty much every American a couple of months ago. If that isn't a universal basic income one-off payment, I don't know what is. So I think that we are going to have this debate. My own view has always been, I'm somewhat skeptical of UBI, at least for most places. And the reason is, one, the cost of it. I mean, it is just to provide a basic income that is genuinely an amount that people can live off would require an increase in taxation that is really extremely, extremely large. Secondly, and of course you can claw it back with higher taxes, I get that, but it is a dramatic change. And like you, I think there is a kind of sense of self-worth and contribution that comes from work, and that therefore I've been always much keener on topping up people's wages. So in the United States, there's a system called EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is effectively a negative tax rate. So it tops up the wages of people whose market wage is below whatever you believe to be a sort of an appropriate one. And it's essentially an idea that Milton Friedman espoused, half a century ago, but I think is actually the right one. So you link effort, but you top it up to a minimum. But I think that the question is absolutely right. This is going to be a very live post-pandemic debate. I think it was already there with the whole debate about, are computers and artificial intelligence going to mean that there's no jobs for anybody? Therefore, shouldn't we have a UBI? It's now been accelerated by the pandemic.
One of the questions that we've got is from Subir Mukherjee, and he's asked basically, what's the future of the car industry after all this? As in, and I think the larger question here is, how are we going to get about? Are we going to get about? If so, will we trust public transport? Is it going to be bad or good? It's for cars in particular. I think it's very interesting that Milan, which was so badly hit, and which was the first city that first sort of large city that we heard about dealing with the coronavirus, when they reopened, had to essentially say, no, we're doubling down on public transport. We know you don't want to take it, but we're going to increase its sort of salience in your life.
So I think it's a really interesting question, and there's sort of three parts of the answer. One is that the world's car industry was one of the most heavily hit industries. I mean, they were all asking for bailouts, right? Because they were literally haven't been able to sell anything, and they're industries that have many of the big car companies are in big trouble. Secondly, I think that you are going to see people, and I've seen anecdotally in some places people wanting to be in cars rather than on public transport, because as you say, while the pandemic is still raging, it feels safer. And there's going to be, I'm sure, some innovation there. Smaller kinds of cars for the city centre, which leads me to what I hope would be the big change that comes from this, which is massive innovation in the direction that some of the leading car companies are already going to, renewable-based electric vehicles. I mean, that's what one would want this to be. One would want this to be a moment of transformation in the industry towards a more environmentally sustainable form of car. And if I could just sort of broaden that, I think the one silver lining that could come out of this whole awful pandemic is if we use this moment of dramatic fiscal expansion that we've talked about, restructuring of many industries, to accelerate what I think we all know we need to accelerate, which is our progress on climate change. And that would be then taking something that, a really much needed long-term good out of this terrible pandemic.
But as you correctly pointed out a little earlier, that kind of basic structural transformation, which will in the end involve remaking some companies and entire sectors, maybe some companies dying, doesn't quite fit with the kind of rescue packages that basically...
No, it doesn't, but it could be made to. So you could have stimulus packages or economy strengthening packages which hark back to the old economy. So, and this was what worries me, subsidies for coal-fired plants, subsidies for car companies to produce their existing cars. That would be exactly what we wouldn't want. But you could also use this moment, and we're already doling money out to these companies. Let's at least use this in public policy terms to set the framework with a system of carbon taxes, with a system in renewable grids, with public investment in renewable grids, that then sets us up for a much greener future.
Thank you. A couple more questions have come in from Rahul Sen, Vivek Jindgar, and so on and so forth on dealing with China in the future. And I'm not going to sort of paraphrase them, some of them are quite long, but I think the question that on a lot of people's minds is that, and I think maybe part of this is because for the first time in 100 years, there's been a global crisis in the United States. The first time since the last influenza pandemic, actually, probably it's fair to say. And it's quite extraordinary that people are now saying in how we approach the global economy going forward, our primary question is going to have to be how to deal with China's weight in it. And there are, as one person points out, maybe it's a bad idea, which many politicians in India have suggested, to boycott Chinese goods. All right. It's not just a bad idea, it may currently be impossible. And other people are pointing out that there is no clear consensus across countries on how to deal with China, though there is a consensus that their global weight, again, is a problem of some kind. How, in the absence of the United States, could you even conceive of a consensus to deal with China post-pandemic emerging?
Well, I think in the absence of the United States, it's very, very hard to make progress on any of this because, the world's biggest economy and the world's second biggest economy, the world's the superpower of the 20th century, and certainly the kind of aspiring great power in which China thinks it is, need to be at the center of this dialogue. And for me, this is the single most important relationship that will shape the 21st century. It's the single most important determinant of whether we have a prosperous future and indeed a peaceful future. And I don't know, many of you watching may have heard of this rather gloomy book by Graham Allison at Harvard called The Thucydides Trap, which argues, somewhat convincingly but rather depressingly, that history shows that whenever you have an aspiring power kind of challenging an existing hegemon, you end up with conflict. Now, I have never believed that was inevitable, but I must say that in the last 3-4 years, the tension that has developed between these two countries, the inability to think strategically towards finding a way that two countries with very different political systems, very different aspirations, can coexist and can help shape the world. We're just simply not there, and I find that very, very worrying. I think that if you look at China, many of the complaints that the Trump administration has voiced, sometimes inelegantly, are absolutely accurate. China has not played by the rules of the World Trade Organization. China is a kind of an authoritarian regime that is getting more authoritarian. It is an alarming regime in many ways, but nonetheless, it is at the same time. If you look from China's perspective, I think the view increasingly in China is that the US is a declining power determined to prevent China returning to its rightful place at the sort of the top table of the world, and it does deserve to be there. And so, if we don't, it's absolutely imperative that there is a way that those economies outside China, led by the United States. I don't think you can do it without the United States, but with the United States, Europe, India, the big emerging economies, that we find a way collectively to deal with China such that we can create a 21st century international order. And it's not going to be exactly the same as the one of the last 70 years, because the last 70 years were dominated by the US in the way that the 21st century isn't going to be completely dominated by the US. But we're not, I don't think not only we're not anywhere near creating that, we have actually these two powers on an increasingly dangerous, conflicting trajectory. I mean, I really worry about the relationship between the two getting, really getting out of control, the tensions between the two. And it is, Hong Kong, the conversations now about Taiwan, all of this stuff is individually okay, but collectively, you don't quite know. And the US is, certainly in the Trump administration, is a sort of, very transactional, somewhat unpredictable, not terribly keen to work with allies. That's all, I think, deeply worrying.
But I mean, to what degree is this the current administration in the US and the current leadership of the People's Republic, which, in many ways are very similar, in their sort of the fact that half of what they see seems to be determined by the most dotty nationalists on their respective social media. It's So
I think there's something to that. Let me take the US. I think in the United States, certainly the tone is very much affected by this current administration. President Trump is, he has a real estate mogul's view of foreign policy. It's transactional in the extreme. There is no strategic concept really there. There's no real sense of the value of allies. We know all of that stuff. But actually, within the United States, in the past 3-4 years, I think there's been a fundamental shift amongst what you might call the kind of broad business and foreign policy elite in both parties, towards seeing China as a dangerous strategic rival. It used to be the view that China would become a kind of responsible stakeholder. You bring China into the WTO, it becomes a more liberal place. It starts playing by the global rules. And I think there's increasingly a view on both sides that just hasn't happened. It hasn't played by the rules. It's one of the reasons many middle Americans have really felt that they've been hurt by globalization. Not only is it not played by the rules, it's getting worse, it's getting more aggressive. And so this sense of skepticism of what China's motives are is pervasive in both parties in the US. So I think the mood music would change if you had a different presidency. I'm not sure that the underlying position would change all of that dramatically. There would almost certainly be much more effort made to bring other allies along. And that would be the big difference and the big positive difference.
Oh, thank you, Zanny. I think we're almost out of time. I'm sorry to all of those who asked questions that I can't take, Om Prakash Parekh, Modik Jain, and so on. But we're all out of time, and I've enjoyed the conversation tremendously. Zanny, I hope you did too. Thank you for being here.
So have I. Thank you for having me.
Thank you both. I mean, that conversation could have gone on forever. Fascinating and I suppose frightening at one level or many levels. Especially for us who are in the event space. Zanny, we're terrified. I'm going to go and slash my wrist and throw myself off the balcony just immediately after.
No, don't do that. You're innovating. Look, you're already innovating.
Thought about that, yes.
This is the future of events. It's going to be a mixture of some live events and a lot of very innovative virtual ones.
Well, we hope so. We've been trying to do our bit, so to speak, but let's see. But thank you both. And as Mihir said, we're really sorry for not being able to take all those millions of questions streaming in from YouTube and Facebook. But maybe we'll send them out, and if Zaini and Mihir would be happy to answer them, we will post them back. Um, we thank our official radio partners, Red FM Bajate Raho. Please do remember to log in next Wednesday, the 3rd of June, for another set of exciting sessions from JLF's Brave New World. We've got Maza Mingiste in conversation with Nandini Nair with the Shadow King. Maza Mingiste was born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, a Fulbright scholar and professor at Queen's College. She's the author of Beneath the Lion's Gaze and a 2018 recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. Here she talks to Nandini Nair about her new novel, The Shadow King. This will be at 7:30 p.m. IST, 3 p.m. British Summer Time, and 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. This will be followed by Roger Highfield and Magdalene Zanika Getz in conversation, a compelling conversation on how a few tiny cells becomes the fantastically complex whole that is the human being. Roger Highfield is the science director of the Science Museum Group UK, and Magdalene is, I think, Caltech and University of Cambridge's development biologist, who will take us through a moving celebration of the balletic beauty of life's beginning as they discuss their co-authored and critically acclaimed The Dance of Life, Symmetry Cells, and How We Become Human. And this will be 9 p.m. IST, 4:30 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And now we present a short extract from the archives of the Jaipur Morning Music Stage, featuring Amrit Kaur Lohia, a London-based sarangi player and vocalist in the genre of Punjabi folk, jazz, and soul. She's toured internationally and has performed at Glastonbury. Lohia trained as a theatre director at the Young Vic and graduated with distinction in history from SOAS. And before we leave you, remember that Rajasthan is opening itself for tourism starting on 1st June. Enjoy the music, have a lovely week, and see you back on Wednesday.
रब मिलदा जंगल फिरियां ते रब मिलदा गाइयां बछियां नूं वे मियां बुलिया रब उन्हां नूं मिलदा अते दिलियां सच्चियां अच्छियां नूं कदी नफ्स अपने नाल लड़िया नहीं रखियो भला झूले लालन सिंदड़ी दा सेवण दा सखी शाबास कलंदर दमादम मस्त कलंदर अली दम दम दे अंदर लाल मेरी हो लाल मेरी लाल मेरी हो लाल मेरी चार चिराग तेरे बलन हमेशा चार चिराग तेरे बलन हमेशा पंजवा बालन आया भला झूले लालन सिंदड़ी दा सेवण दा सखी शाबास कलंदर दमादम मस्त कलंदर अली दम दम दे अंदर लाल मेरी हो लाल मेरी लाल मेरी हो लाल मेरी ऊंचा रोजा पीरा तेरा ऊंचा रोजा पीरा तेरा हेठ वागे दरे या भला झूले लालन सिंदड़ी दा सेवण दा सखी शाबास कलंदर दमादम मस्त कलंदर अली दम दम दे अंदर लाल मेरी हो लाल मेरी लाल मेरी हो लाल मेरी मामा नू पीरा बचड़े देना मामा नू पीरा बचड़े देना पैणा नू देना वीर मिला झूले लालन सिंदड़ी दा सेवण दा सखी शाबास कलंदर दमादम मस्त कलंदर अली दम दम दे अंदर लाल मेरी हो लाल मेरी लाल मेरी हो लाल मेरी जनन जनन तेरी नौबत बाजे जनन जनन तेरी नौबत बाजे जनन 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 तेरी नौबत बाजे